think we're on. Good evening or good afternoon, everyone who is listening to us. Welcome to 273rd WJUG meeting. This is our 2019-2020 season finale. The last speech of the season will be provided by our special guest, Nathaniel Schutta. And it was a quite adventurous year for all of us and for WJUG, of course, as well. We had to keep our distances, and WJUG went full online. We are very happy to do so, but hopefully future will bring us some relax in that matter, and we'll be able to meet in person in real life again. Okay, as always at the beginning, I would like to thank our regular partners for making us meeting here and for having great prices that we can share with you. We have a code for licenses from JetBrains, we have books from the Zeto, and we have a workshops from Stacja IT, and as our long-term partner, Software Mill, which is making all the background things for WJUG happening smoothly. Earlier on the Facebook, we announced it a kind of giveaway, an opportunity to win a pizza, because all of you that meets in a WJUG meeting, the pizza is a very important part of our meetups. So we gave away 5 delicious pizza pies, and hopefully all the winners are with us today. There was a meme that are around Java. This is the winner one. So the final monitor that can display an entire Java class name. That was, in our opinions, the most enjoyable one. And we have photos from all of our contested winners with the pizza and the fact that they are indeed watching us tonight. The summer break is ahead of us. As I mentioned, this is our last meeting in this season, but we are waiting for you. We are waiting for you as speakers. And if you have any doubts, if you're ready, I think you are, but come to us, approach us, contact us in any way, and we'll discuss it. But we also want you as a leader. We want your ideas. So if you want to be a part of what we are doing here, please contact us via email, on Facebook, Twitter, or on the JVM Poland Slack that gathers all of Java developers in Poland. It's a great community, and I really just please come on, technical, yeah. Just go to this link, and if you're not yet part of this community, just do it. It's definitely worth it. And when it comes to today's meeting, it will be held as we usually do on our online meetings lately. We encourage you to post any questions on the fly, and we'll be passing those questions during the talk to Nate. If there will be more general type of questions, we'll leave it after the presentation. And if you have a very general question on the questions that requires big discussion, please keep it for the after talk integration meeting on Google Meet that we plan to hold if there will be interested people. Then you'll be able to discuss it with Nate face to face. Remember that the most active viewers will be awarded with the prizes from our partners that I mentioned before. And the link to the integration talk will be posted on the YouTube chat later after the presentation. I think that's everything from my side. So without further ado, the screen is yours, Nate. Thank you very much for being here and sharing this presentation with us.
Well, fantastic. Thank you for having me, and thanks to all of you for joining us here this evening. For me, it's the afternoon. Yeah, technically it is afternoon. It's 12:05 where I am. So I've been to Poland many times. I think if I remember right, it's the number 2 country most visited for me in terms of international travel. I think the UK is still number 1. I've spent a lot of time in Krakow. I think I've only been to Warsaw once, if memory serves, but I'm sorry that I can't be there with you in person. And fingers crossed that we can make this happen in meat space or in real life, as they say here, sometime next year or whenever we get a.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, I'm fingers crossed we get this thing figured out, because I kind of miss being on the road, to be honest with you. It's nice to be home. Don't get me wrong. I enjoy my home. I enjoy being in my own bed. I don't miss airplanes particularly much, but I do miss the opportunity to go visit places that I love and hang out in cities that I enjoy being in, and seeing people, seeing my friends all around the world. So it's unfortunate. But thank you for being here with me. We're going to talk about architecture here today. Best way to describe me is architect as a service. I work for VMware. I was as part of the Pivotal acquisition. I was at Pivotal before that. And then before I joined Pivotal, I've been an architect, lead developer type person for mostly financial services, but a couple other companies in and around my career. So I've thought quite a bit about this over the last 15 or so years. If you're interested in what I'm talking about, and I assume you are, otherwise you wouldn't be hanging out with me on a sunny summer afternoon, I did take time to write this down in prose form. So if you're interested in some of the ideas I'm talking about, or you want to sort of get it refreshed, or just have a more consumable variant of this, feel free to grab the ebook from us, and cover a lot of the same material in there. Imagine that. Now, I remember when I was just young, naive developer person, I looked at being an architect and said, that's what I want to be when I grow up. That sounds like a good gig. And then I became an architect and realized, hey, this is harder than I thought it was going to be. I've got to deal with competing agendas and the politics of my organization, which is no fun. But I'm also really at the head of all the technology change that happens in this industry. And that's not a surprise to anyone who's been in our line of work for more than about 5 minutes. You realize pretty quickly that technology change is a constant. Now, I didn't appreciate that when I first joined software. I don't remember exactly what it was, but pretty early on in my career, I missed some wave or another, and I was disappointed. I thought, oh, that was my one chance to get in on the ground floor of a technology. And of course, now with the value of experience, I can look back and say how naive I used to be, because there's always a new technology. They're a lot like a bus. Every 15 minutes or so, a new one comes along. And of course, with experience, you start to realize, oh, I'm going to let that one go by because I've seen how that story ends and I don't really want a part of it. And so you start to realize that this is a good part of being in this industry. It's really a feature, not a bug. And what I love about it is it's what keeps this stuff interesting. It's what gives us new toys to play with and kind of keeps us refreshed. I've got a golf buddy of mine. Just a couple years ago, we were out one day, and he said, Nate, don't you think you're getting to that point in your career where you should get into management? And I was a little taken aback. I'm like, well, no, John, I like what I do. Why would I want to get into management? And he said, well, when I was about your age, I could do my job cold. It was boring, and then I got into management, and it really revitalized my career because I could work on helping people grow their careers, and I was a force multiplier, and it just really helped kind of reinvigorate my career about when I was your age. And I've reflected upon that, and actually he and I've had this conversation, but I've never really been able to do my job cold because it's always evolving, it's always changing, it's always something new and different. And that's both reassuring, but it's also a little terrifying too, because as technologists, we don't want to be on a legacy platform. We don't want to be the last company, the last team using some outdated technology. But by the same token, I can't be a little hummingbird floating from one thing to another every few seconds, because there will always be something new. There will always be something that we just invented. If we're not careful, we end up where one of my students was. She came to me and said, my app has 4 different UI frameworks baked into it now. The second one makes sense. We need to start evolving, or the old one isn't supported anymore, or there's some feature we can't match with the old one. But the third one is when someone on the team should have said, whoa, 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 we don't want to do this. And by the fourth one, someone should have flipped a proverbial table and said, absolutely not. But I understand how this happens, because developers look at this and go, oh, hey, this is fun new stuff. I just read about this on Twitter. I want to play with that. And so I'll say it's the right thing to do for our project. So we need to avoid that. And we also need to realize that one of the most important skills that we have to have as good technologists is the ability to evaluate new technologies. I teach a grad class every so often at the University of Minnesota, and this is really what I hammer on with my students is you have to be a good consumer of technology, a responsible consumer of technology, because there's always going to be something new. And it's the challenge for us then is how do you evaluate that? Because here's the thing, I don't know what's coming next. Believe me, I wish I did. I wish I had that crystal ball. Although, frankly, if I was able to predict the future, I'd probably focus my efforts on sports betting and the stock market. But, to each your own. So no one knows what's coming next. There is one guarantee, though. What we're going to be using in 5 years is different than what we're using today. In fact, I'd go so far as to say there's a pretty good chance we'll be using something in the future that hasn't even been invented yet. So in our industry, there's this sort of constant pressure to chase the new thing. And, technology change, again, I don't think this is a brilliant statement. I think everybody realizes this after a few minutes in our industry. The temptation for us is to avoid always chasing the new hotness, to be very careful of the bleeding edge. And I've thought about this a lot. Uh, Bleeding edge implies you're going to bleed. I mean, that's why it's called the bleeding edge and not the everything's going to work out great edge. And yet, as technologists, we're just like, heck, yeah, sign me up for that. Where else in your life do you want the bleeding edge thing? So about a year and a half ago, I had my right hip replaced, and when I met with my surgeon for the first time, I assure you, if I'd have walked into his office and he would have said, "Oh, Nate, I'm so glad you came in today. Listen, I was just on Twitter and I read about this new experimental technique. Can I do it to you?" My answer would be to back slowly out of his office and find a different surgeon. I wanted the thing that he's done thousands of times. In fact, in my pre-op appointment, he could tell I was a little nervous, a little anxious, and to kind of put me at ease, he reminded me of just how many of these he's done. And he said, "Nate, this is like falling off a log for me. It's going to be fine." But then in technology, we're like, "Oh, heck yeah, please give me that thing no one's ever used before." And I understand why, because it's fun for us. It's an interesting thing to do, and we can get bored when we play with the old stuff. And so having new toys to play with is definitely something that's important for us. And I will stress, it is an important part of being in this industry. You have to be good at learning new things. And I saw this tweet and I thought this really helps summarize what we're trying to deal with. As a programmer, the most important skill is, can you teach yourself new things? You're going to constantly be picking up new technologies. That's much more important than an individual tool or technology. And to me, this is one of the most frustrating things I have with how we hire people in this industry. We get so focused on this little checklist of skills and must have n number of years of this and so many months of that. Why? It's going to be outdated in 2 or 3 years. So can you learn new things is a much more important question. I have a colleague that I ran into back when we could still get on airplanes, and we were at an event in his backyard in, I think, January. And I was chatting with him, and he was telling me that both of his children are now in college and they're both studying computer science. And I said, "Do they realize they've just signed up for a lifetime of learning?" And he just laughed and said, "No, not yet." It's much more important that developers show the ability to learn new things than we get so fixated on this one individual tool or technology. I think to me, that's really what we should be trying to get out of a job interview. And it's important to remember that education is not something that you finish, especially in this line of work. We're going to constantly be pressed and pushed to learn and play with new things. I don't think there's too many industries that throw away knowledge at quite the clip we do. It's also important to understand that our sort of understanding of a technology goes through this constant evolution. And Ben Evans has got a great thread about this. There's things that you're just playing around with, and there's things that you just know what other people's opinions are, and there's things that you have a strong opinion on. And of course, in technology, things are constantly moving in between these spaces. There's stuff that you were an expert on, but you haven't used it now in a while, and there's things that you're currently doing day in day out. There's things you don't follow anymore. And I love this line at the end: by the point you really understand something, it's probably irrelevant. And there's a lot of truth to that. There's things that I used to do quite a bit. I used to do a lot of front end work, and so I was very in depth on all the different UI frameworks and which one should you use and which one do I like. But I haven't really done a lot of front end work now in a few years, so I'm really not up to speed on, well, is it Angular, is it React, is it Vue, is it something else? I don't know. Maybe it's something else. For all I know, somebody invented something else 6 months ago. Now, to be clear, developers have opinions, and these are often very strong opinions. Anyone want to debate tabs versus spaces with me this afternoon? Well, this evening for you, I suppose. I don't know how many of you watch Silicon Valley, but my wife and I watched that show, and it was a little sad to see it finally wrap up. But all good things must come to an end. And one episode, the lead male character breaks up with this wonderful woman over tabs versus spaces. And I about fell off the couch laughing. I thought, this is so funny. And my wife, who's a business analyst, just kind of looked at me and didn't understand why it was funny. And so I explained it to her, and it got no funnier for her, unfortunately. So that must just be one of our things, I guess. Now, I will say that a lot of developers have a very surface level knowledge of these technologies that they have these very strong opinions on. And a lot of that focuses on the name. I've had a lot of people say, "Oh, Nate, we got to use, Mongo on this project." And I'm like, "Why?" And they just repeat the name. "Oh, cuz Mongo." Cool, but why? What's let's go beneath that and dig a little deeper. And it's important to realize that there's a big difference between knowing the name of a thing and knowing something about that thing. So be at least a little cautious there. I also think that we have this healthy fear of the old. I think many of us early on in our career, someone kind of takes us aside and says, "Hey, don't have a legacy skill set. So if you want or need a new job, you have, an easy avenue to make that happen." I remember early in my career, I was working with this individual who had the retirement countdown screensaver going, and it was like a 4-digit number. And so I was not surprised when that thing hit zero and we had his Bon Voyage party. But I was a little surprised when about 6 months later, I ran into him in the building and I'm like, "Hey, Dick, what are you doing here today?" And he said, "Oh, Nate, it's the darndest thing. I'm working 3 days a week and they're paying me more than when I was a full-time guy." I thought, huh, that's interesting. I want to get paid more to do less, you jackass. How do I make that work? And what I realized in reflection is that this guy had a legacy skill set. He had an old skill set, but he was able to turn that into a nice contract because he knew JCL and Telon and COBOL and DB2 and IMS and knew where all the skeletons were buried because he put most of them in the code base. And so he took this old skill set and turned it into a very nice payday for himself. So maybe we are a little too quick to just dismiss the old. Now we have to know when it's time to jump. That's the hard part, is knowing, yes, this is end of life. No one else is doing this anymore. It's time for me to move on to something else, and be prepared to put in the work to do that. But I do think there's something to be said for the experience of knowing this is like that thing we used to do. I love this one. I'm the grumpy fellow in the back who says, "Isn't that just like SQL queries from the front end, like PHP?" There's a lot to be said for being able to hear the echoes of the past. And I do think that we need to pay more attention to this, because there's lots of instances where we did something before and some of those constraints have been removed now. And so it'll actually work now, but it wouldn't have worked in the past. And so it's good for us to be able to compare and contrast and know, this is like that thing we used to do, but it's better now because these things have been fixed, or these things are no longer an issue. We think about like microservices. If you would have gone to your infrastructure people 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and said, "Hey, here's what I want to do. I want to spin up 300 instances of the app server in all of our regions." The infrastructure people's heads would have exploded and you'd never be allowed to talk to them again, because at the time that was just ridiculous. There's no way you could do that. 15 years ago, the idea of being truly polyglot was, not going to happen, because how can we stand up all these possible, tech stacks? Well, we can now because the environments let us do these things. And so being able to compare and contrast how this is like what we used to do and how things have improved, or maybe how things have stayed the same, is a really valuable part of having some experience in our industry. I talk about the fear of the old, and I do think we always tend to dismiss the old as saying, "Oh, it's arcane and complex," whereas the new is simple and elegant. And Jeff goes on to say, actually, we got to remember that the new is usually unfinished, buggy, and unproven, whereas the old is refined and stable and tested. And so my favorite example of this is JUnit. If you came to me in your next Java project and said, "Oh, Nate, I'm not going to use JUnit," and I said, "Well, why not?" And you said, "Well, because it's old." How old is JUnit? I mean, I think JUnit can legally drink in any country on the planet now. I believe it's more than 20 years old now. So if you said you didn't want to use it because it was old, I'd push back on that. I'd be a little skeptical. That's not the best reason to throw JUnit aside. Now, if you said this other tool lets me do things that JUnit can't, all right, that's something we should talk about. So we need to be able to look beyond just the shiny new thing and realize that sometimes it's better just to use the old proven thing as opposed to throw our lot in with this brand new thing that we haven't really had any experience with yet. Now, I've noticed throughout my career, there's a very predictable hype cycle involved in software. And luckily for me, my friend and colleague Kote tweeted this out. And so I immediately stole it. He has a theory, by the way, that if you put enough t- uh, screenshots of tweets into a folder, a presentation spontaneously is created. And I think he's probably right about that. So a new technology comes out and we're like, oh my God, this is amazeballs. And then a little while later, we're like, ooh, God, this is pretty hard to use, right? A little while later, actually, you should never use this, especially if you're just trying to put like a web front end on a relational database. Ooh, look, something shiny and new, rinse, repeat. Now, my only quibble with Kote's tweet is the label shouldn't be years. The label should be months, maybe weeks, because that's what I've seen time and time again. Is we get very excited about a new thing, we play with it. Oh God, this doesn't work, and then we jump onto the next shiny new thing. Oh, thank God, there's something new and shiny to replace our attention span. The challenge for us here is how do we know where not to use a technology? For better or worse, what this boils down to is trial and error. This is how we learn. If you've got kids, pretty good chance, when they come home from school, back when they used to leave the house to go to school, you'd come home from school and you'd ask them, "How was your day?" And depending on the age of your child, you'd usually get some kind of a grunt or a similar guttural noise. And I was talking to a fellow parent about this one day, and hoping that they would commiserate or give me some hint on how to, pull things out for my kid. Because I want to engage, I want to know what's going on in your life. And this person said, "Well, hang on, Nate, think about it. Your kids get home from school, and our kids have had a long day, and they've been failing all day because that's what school is. And so they don't want to talk about it because they've been failing all day. Because again, that's how we teach. My son was complaining about something. I can't remember what it was. And I looked at him. I said, dude, if you already knew how to do that, we wouldn't bother to teach you that. We would just find something harder to do until we figured out where that breaking point was. And then we'd rinse repeat. The other thing I like to use as an example here, since we always borrow from construction, so many of our terms come from the construction industry. Architect is a perfect example. Think about building buildings, whatever building you're in right now, your home, your apartment, the materials that we use in building buildings now are things that we as a species have used for millennia, steel, concrete, glass, wood. We're getting pretty good at it. You know, a lot of builders are pretty good at being able to tell you this is how long that project's going to take. Now, of course, there's always interesting little things that come up. If you've ever done home renovation, you know that the schedule is a little flexible. I think I get a kick out of the fact that people always say software doesn't know how to do estimates, and I always laugh and say, do a home renovation project, see what happens there with their estimates. But if you think about buildings, we've been doing this for millennia, really, at this point. And I'm going to go on a limb and say when we first started building buildings, we weren't very good at it. I bet they fell down a lot. I bet there were integration issues. I bet we had some struggles figuring out what this material can and can't do and what's appropriate for this climate versus that climate. And oh, hey, there's earthquakes here. So maybe we got to build the buildings a little different here than we do somewhere else. Yeah. And what we lose sight of is we've taken that trial and error and we've written it down in these things called building codes. And so if you build a building, you build a home in various parts of the world, there are rules and regulations you have to follow. I live in Minnesota. It gets cold here in the winter, it gets hot here in the summer. And so there's a certain minimum level of insulation you have to have in any home that gets built here. That's different than what you would have if I lived in Georgia, for instance, where it doesn't get anywhere remotely as cold as it does here. So we've written these rules down. And then in software, we're being asked to constantly build something no one's ever built before using tools we just invented. And then people are shocked that we can't give them a down to the minute estimate of how long this is going to take. Now, the best way I can really sum this up is to show you a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. I love Calvin. Calvin was a foundational part of my childhood. My son discovered Calvin. I think this was maybe 6 or 7 years ago now. And so at this point, I have reread every Calvin cartoon probably 50 times. And there's one that absolutely proves to me that Watterson was a software engineer. He just didn't know it. And it's this one right here. How do they know the load limit on a bridge, Dad? Well, they just drive bigger and bigger trucks over the bridge until the bridge breaks. Then they weigh the last truck and rebuild the bridge. Oh, should have guessed. This is what we do. We do this all the time. Is Mongo a good choice for this project? I don't know. Let's try it and find out. Will our application support several 100,000 concurrent users? I have no idea. Let's try it and find out. Now, I have noticed that developers tend to have a short attention span. And I don't know what's cause and effect here. I don't know if we get into this industry because we have short attention spans, or being in this industry gives you a short attention span, but we tend to act an awful lot like dogs chasing squirrels. It's just like, ooh, new squirrel, run after that one. Oh, Kafka. Oh, messenger. We just always are searching for that new thing. And to be fair, the advantage here is learning is what keeps this fresh. It's what gives us sort of reinvigoration, new things to play with, new things to try. But at some point, I have to deliver business value. I got to get code to production. And frankly, I can't do that if I'm always experimenting. At some point, I have to make a commitment. I have to decide, yes, this is what we're going to do. We're going to stick with this for a period of time. We're going to develop some expertise in that. And never forget, bleeding edge means you will bleed. This isn't some clever name. I mean, that's why they call it the bleeding edge. Now, I was talking to somebody last summer. I don't remember what the technology was, doesn't really matter. And they were complaining about it. And I said, well, hang on a sec. When did you start playing with it? And he said, oh, I don't know, about 4 months ago. I said, well, I think if I remember right, it just went 1.0 like 2 weeks back. So you were playing around with it when it was like 0.5, 0.6, 0.7. Of course, things are going to change. Of course, it's going to be a bit unstable. Why does that surprise you? Now I understand the other side of the coin. We all tend to fall into this bucket. You're playing around with the technology, and then they make some tweaks, and then, oh God, you break all the things that used to work. And it gives me all these hours of fun workaround. I actually had to completely nuke and pave my personal website because the version of the website generator, the static website generator I was using, had so many fundamental changes. I couldn't get my website as it was originally written to work in this sort of newish format. And so I just had to nuke and pave and start over. And, fingers crossed I don't have to do that again, except I'm guessing I probably will. There's that old adage, how do you know who the pioneers are? Well, they're the ones with the arrows in their back. And so the challenge for us as technologists is we need to be strategic. We need to think about this strategically. So I want and need to avoid dead platforms. Again, we don't want to be the last person on this thing, but I have to balance that against the fact that I can't constantly be changing direction. So I need to be strategic. I need to think strategically. Now, the first thing I always have to say about strategy is hope is not a strategy. This is what most companies try to do. They think hope is all that they need. The nicest thing I can say about hope is it's what rebellions are built on. That's it. As technologists, we need to be deliberate. One of the big challenges we face is the reality that there are a lot of bits out there every time you turn around. There's something new. There's a new language, a new technique, a new approach. Somebody's taking two or three things and mashing it together, or, oh yeah, we did all this and now we're throwing that away. We're doing. I see this with microservices now. It's kind of been our big buzzword for a few years, and now I hear people talking about macro services and right size services. We're really good at kind of inventing new things. We're not so good at figuring out where the old things actually work. The challenge that poses us, and I'm kind of preaching to the choir here because you all are taking part of your evening out to listen to me, ramble on, as opposed to doing any of the literally countless other things you could be doing with your time, going for a bike ride, playing golf, watching TV, whatever makes you happy. The challenge for us is, how do you keep up? How do you stay abreast of the new stuff that's going on in this industry? And to be fair, a lot of this boils down to your learning style. So maybe you prefer reading things, maybe it's blogs, maybe it's books, maybe you follow a bunch of people on Twitter, maybe you listen to a bunch of podcasts, maybe you go to conferences. You folks again are hanging out with me. I appreciate that. But you start to realize fairly quickly that this industry, it's a bit of a merry-go-round. In fact, a manager of mine used that terminology with me once. I was talking to her, this was a long time ago. I said, why did you get out of technology? Why did you become a manager? And she said, Nate, I got tired of being on the technology merry-go-round. I got tired of having to constantly learn new things. And I was a little surprised by that. I thought, well, that's interesting. I mean, there's nothing new in management, like how to manage people, how to help them grow their career, yada, yada. But I appreciate it now. I understand because, again, we've all thrown away so much knowledge in this line of work, and it can be a little disheartening when you're like, well, I used to know how to do that, and now that's gone. But the challenge for us is really making this a habit. It's got to be part of your routine. And so I think it's on us to block out part of our week. And I think Friday afternoon is a good place to start. I'm very much of the opinion that anybody who books a meeting with you Friday afternoon has committed a hostile act. Although ironically enough, my stand-up meeting for a while was on Friday afternoon, and I called my boss out on it after he scheduled it. I'm like, what are you doing? Why do you hate us? And he said, well, it's the only time of the week you're not all on airplanes, so I figure it's as good as any. And I'm like, oh, ugly. but fine. What am I going to do? It's his meeting. But maybe for whatever reason you work for kind of a sadist or something. So maybe it's Tuesday over lunch. Maybe it's Monday morning. I don't know. Whatever fits your schedule, but you have to be proactive in blocking it out. That's not to say you can't schedule over it if you have to, if there's a big crunch, but it's got to be a habit. It's got to be something you do regularly. Now, I'm a big fan of something that I've come to refer to as morning coffee. And I've done this throughout my career, but I didn't really have a terminology for it until I was talking to a friend of mine about it. And he said, "Oh, I do the same thing. I call it morning coffee." And so I've since stolen this term from him. But you take the first 15, 20, 30 minutes in the morning to peruse the news, whatever that means for you, Twitter, Reddit, InfoQ, whatever your favorite sources are. And, you take that time with that first cup of coffee, tea, energy drink, water, whatever your beverage of choice is, but you do it in the morning. You do it first thing before the day gets away from you, because we've all had that experience. You're heading into the office, or, for most of us now, you're going to your wherever you're set up your temporary space, and you're thinking, "Oh, good, today I'm finally going to get to A, B, and C on my list." And then like contact with the enemy happens. And at the end of the day, you're kind of stumbling around exhausted, and you're like, "Well, I don't know what happened, but I didn't get remotely close to my list." Hope springs eternal that tomorrow I'll finally have a chance. The reality is, attention is the most precious resource you have. And I am genuinely appreciative of the fact that you are taking time out of your day. You're giving me some of this attention, and I hope I'm giving you a good return on that investment. But it's a resource. And my friend Mike Nygaard had a great tweet about this. He says, "It's a resource, it does not scale." God, I wish there was an easy way to just say, "Please give me more attention, give me more time." It doesn't work that way, right? It is a limited resource. You have to spend it wisely. I love this quote. It's a bit like real estate. They're not making any more of it. Unlike real estate, though, the value of it keeps going up. Do not waste your attention. By definition, you need to be selective. By definition, you can't read it all. You will miss almost everything that gets produced. Sorry, just the nature of the beast. There was a point in time in human history where you actually could have read everything that had been produced. We don't live in that point of time in history. And had you lived at that point of time in human history, you probably would have been illiterate anyway. So, trade offs. I've struggled with this throughout my career, to be real honest with you. I used to subscribe to a lot of magazines. For those of you that are on the younger side, a magazine's kind of like the internet, except it was printed out and bound and sent to you on a periodic basis. The reality is, I wasn't reading many of those magazines. And so I finally let most of my magazine subscriptions lapse. And at this point, I just subscribe to like two or three of the things that I read cover to cover, and I enjoy the content. It's something that's important to me. And what would typically happen to me is these magazines would just pile up on the island in my kitchen. I would walk by the pile would fall over, and my wife would give me a look suggesting that was an excellent opportunity to go through the pile. And I would recycle almost all of it because it wouldn't be relevant anymore. It was newsy, and I didn't need to read about something that happened 3 months ago. It wasn't important today. Well, now I've cut that list down, and and that was hard to do. In fact, there was one in particular I remember my wife, I think, asked me like 3 or 4 times, "Are you sure you want me to let this go?" And I think I'd subscribed to that magazine for like 20 years. It was crazy. And I said, "Yeah, I think it's okay. I've got like a year's worth of them right here. So if I haven't taken time to read it yet, I probably won't." And that's not an indictment on the magazines. Phenomenal writers, great articles, things I was interested in. I just couldn't bring myself to take the time to read it. Now, the challenge here is we have a little bit of that fear of missing out. And so we're worried that we're going to miss something. And here's what I'll tell you. If it's a big enough deal, it will bubble up into your consciousness. Even if you don't want it to, even if you're trying to avoid it, you will hear about it. There's only so much you can avoid. And you might not hear about it right away. It might take a little while for it to kind of seep into your consciousness, but it will at some point. There's a decent chance, even if you're not in the Apple ecosystem, you are aware that Apple held a conference last week, and one of the things they announced was that they're going to transition from Intel to, I guess they're calling it Apple Silicon now. So they're going to go to their own chips, which is fascinating. Of course, if you've noticed, I think the latest iPad Pro actually is faster than some of the MacBook Pros, which is just crazy to kind of get my head wrapped around. But that's the thing you got to keep in mind. If it's a big enough deal, it will bubble up into your consciousness. You will hear about it, even if you don't want to. And of course, part of what we have to balance here is we can't adopt everything. That way lies madness. So how do I know where to invest my time? Now, some developers will say, I've got an instinct for it, or as Paul Graham calls it, a hacker's radar. And so, Paul Graham, if you're not familiar, a successful entrepreneur, took a business, got it sold, I think, to Yahoo a bunch of years ago, made a bunch of money. He's incubated a bunch of things you probably have used directly or indirectly. He's written a lot of very interesting articles over the years. And so he wrote this piece quite a while back talking about the hacker's radar, and he actually does lay out some really good criteria on how to judge a new technology, a new language, a new framework. And he wraps up his article by saying, I have a hunch that Java won't be a very successful language. Now, we could have a fascinating discussion about where Java ranks in the top 5 most popular, most successful languages of all time. Is it number 1? Is it number 3? I'd love to have that conversation, ideally with an adult beverage in hand. So we can sit here in 2020 and sort of laugh about how he blew this when he got this wrong. And he did admit, well, I've never written any Java, but I've looked at some books. But I do think it's important for us to say, if Paul Graham could be this wrong about Java, maybe I need to be a little just cautious with my own instincts. I know I could be as wrong as well. And so a hunch might not be enough. Now, at the same time I say that, judging covers actually can be a useful filter. Now, I'll give you an example of this. This is, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe? It doesn't matter. A friend of mine at work was really interested in this new technology that somebody in our company had brought in. I was a little skeptical, at least partially because at sort of the very first, I guess, how to use this thing meeting we had with the company, their trainer person got up there and said, "And the best part about our product is you don't need any programmers." And he said this to a room full of programmers. So that kind of got it off on the wrong foot for me. But my friend thought it was great because it was all this WYSIWYG drag and drop kind of thing, and he thought it was really cool, and I was skeptical. And so we were chatting one day, and he was trying to convince me that this was an amazing tool. And I said, "Well, hang on a sec here. How do you do a diff?" And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, this is all WYSIWYG. It's all this drag and drop thing. How do you do a diff? How do you tell what I changed yesterday? So I checked some stuff in. Now you're working on it this morning. How do you see what I did?" And he kind of scrunched up his head. Well, that's a good question. I hadn't thought of that. Well, I could do a screen print, and then I could do a visual comparison. Oh, that's not great. I said, "All right, well, riddle me this. How do I write an automated unit test for this?" He said, "Oh, Nate, that's the best part. You don't have to write any tests because you can't possibly make a mistake. It's all drag and drop. The guidelines, the guardrails make sure you can't make a mistake." And that's when I'm like, all right, I'm out. I'm out. I'm done. This is clearly not something that I want to have anything to do with. And not terribly surprising, although not related to either of those issues, the company did eventually get rid of that particular product. I think it was about a year later, something like that. Now, in the same breath that I say judging covers can be useful, we have to watch out for bias. It's very easy for us to have had that one negative experience with the technology, and then we decide that it's tainted forever. So we have to balance that a little bit and just be a little cautious. You want to think about the community. Where are my people at? Where is everybody else? What are they working on? What do they think is interesting? But we have to watch out for the lemming effect. We've all had that problem where everybody's running off a cliff because, well, I read the same white paper you read. Do they have the same constraints? Do they have the same issues? Is it really applicable? So we have to be a little more than just, well, I read a white paper and it said this technology is amazing. Are you skating to where the puck was? I've seen this multiple times in my career where it's like, well, no, the next step is this. We can actually skip steps. We already know that that's not a good thing. So let's not bother wasting our time on that. I remember at one point, a company I was at was adopting this technology, and 2 or 3 of the people we hired to help us with that technology, the reason we were able to hire them was because the company they were at was getting rid of that technology. And I would have thought that would have been a warning sign, but that was somehow blissfully ignored by the powers that be. I'm a huge believer in the technology radar. This is an artifact that comes out of ThoughtWorks periodically, 2, 3 times a year. And every time one of these comes out, there's always something new and interesting that I learn. And things move between these different states, whether this is something that's brand new or is on its way out versus all the way down to you should absolutely be using this. That's the adopt, the inner circle. There's always something that I learn every time one of these comes out. So I strongly recommend you rely on something like this. I really am disappointed that the Google 20% time thing never really took off. The whole idea here was developers got essentially a day a week to scratch their own itch, work on their own side projects. Of course, that's given rise to a number of products that we all use day in, day out. Never really took off. And eventually, Google even killed it ultimately. And so it's unfortunate that we've gotten rid of that because it acts as such a wonderful relief valve. Oh, you want to play with Go or Rust or whatever the new hotness is? Great. Do it on your side project. If it works out, awesome. We learned something new and interesting. Oh, it didn't work out. Well, that's okay. It was just a side project anyway. Now, I realize that in most corporations, the idea of asking for a day a week to work on side projects probably isn't going to go very far. But maybe we can practice innovation Fridays. And that doesn't have to be every week. Maybe it's once a month. Maybe it's once a quarter, but giving people a chance to play and try things out and innovate is really, really important. And, maybe you've got to start with just Friday afternoon. That's okay too, but you've got to have that outlet, that opportunity to play around and try things. What about a regular Tuesday Tech Talk series? I'm a huge fan of Lunch and Learns. It's a great way, by the way, to practice your presentation chops, as are user group meetings, by the way. I had somebody tell me that, oh yeah, lunch and learns. We call those chew and spews. I thought, no, don't call them that. That's not good. I'm a huge fan of what a friend of mine refers to as architectural briefings, which is just a fancy way of saying one person does some research and then presents it to the team. And you do not need to be an architect to do the presenting, but we want to get ourselves through some, typical questions like why should we use this thing? What do you need to know in order to answer the why? What do you need to know in order to use the thing? These don't need to be long. These don't need to be 3 hour all day kind of affairs. Half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour at the tops. This is not the deep dive how to, but we do want to get beyond sort of hello world. Important to understand these should be participatory events. This should be two-way traffic. We want people taking notes, asking good questions, using their own experience, saying, oh, I used something like this earlier in my career that suffered from issue X and Y. Does this also suffer from issue X and Y? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Why? Why not? And by the way, you should be prepared to do one of these in the future. Now, if we get past the briefing filter, awesome. It's time to roll up our sleeves, get our hands dirty, and do a workshop. Now, here's the challenge with workshop. You're never going to get enough time. Ideally, we'd have months to do this, but you'll get a couple of days, maybe even a couple hours. So you need to make sure that you're doing the most significant things. What are the things we have to prove? What are the things you're most concerned with, most worried about? What are those architecturally significant things? Give yourself a couple hours and play with it. Now, I do want to stress that you want to make sure you understand the constraints of your own environment. So it can be useful to do these within like a fork of your repo potentially. So I had a student a couple years ago who told me that their company was changing their UI technology, and they'd surveyed the field, kind of cut things down to the two or three they thought were viable, and they went off and did some proof of concept work. Well, the problem is they did the proof of concept work greenfield. We're all capable of getting proof of concept to work greenfield. The challenge, of course, is what happens when that makes contact with your existing code. And they sort of got caught up in the hype. That's what he told me anyway. And they adopted this technology and thought they could just sprinkle it into their existing system. It turns out you can't, and they didn't realize that fully or weren't able to admit that to themselves until they were, about 6 months down this path. And when I was speaking with them, they were really debating internally, should we just scrap that and start over and try something different? And so be cautious here. But give yourself as much time as you can. Give yourself some exercises to work through. You want to focus on kind of the how to get beyond setup. Now, if we get past the hands-on filter, it's time to do a trial somewhere in the organization. This is real project work where it's a good fit. I want to stress, not a bet the company project, mind you. We want to actually see again what happens when we put this through the test. Where are the edges of the map? Where are the dragons hiding? Now, of course, the new hotness is not our only concern. We need to think about currency. You look at the kind of bugs that are popping up these days. You look at what happens when we leak data. The Equifax hack was sitting around for months, although amazingly enough, that software still exists in lots of companies, which is hard to believe. But this is starting to be a big deal. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people, billions of people probably at this point have had their information spread all around the interwebs. A buddy of mine is a security researcher, and I was talking to him one day and I said, "Is there any chance my information isn't on the dark web?" And he just laughed. He said, "Do you want to go look for it?" And I'm like, "Nope, nope, don't want to have anything to do with the parts of the internet that you have to hang out on." So this stuff is starting to have a huge impact. I was actually talking with somebody earlier this year who was saying that you have guilt by association in some instances, that he had worked at Equifax, and because it's on his resume, people were a little skeptical of him even in interviews. And of course his part of the application had nothing to do with it, and his part of the application was totally secure, but there was a little bit of that, "Oh, you sure?" Now some people are like, "Oh, I'm not interesting, nobody wants what I'm after," and they took this map down. Unfortunately, it was really interesting to see the real-time attacks that are going on in our industry, and just how constant this probing is. And unfortunately for us, our attackers only need to be right once. We've got to be right all the time. We got all these little velociraptors just looking for unlocked doors. Now I use the word velociraptor. I should probably substitute my cats. My cats are little velociraptors. One of my cats has figured out how to open drawers. And there's no pull on the drawer, so it's not like he can like, kind of hook his paw over it. I mean, he's got to somehow kind of wedge his paw on the side. It's nuts. We'll come home and two or three drawers will be open, and it's like, "Oh, okay, the cat figured out how to get in there." We had to re-baby proof our lower level because our cat kept opening the cupboards, and they'd crawl back in there and mess with stuff. And so my wife actually took all our little door clips and put them back on to try to slow the cats, and they still try. They even there's a couple there's one they can still get into, which is just mind-boggling to me. So I don't know how they figured that one out, but cats, I guess they have a lot of time on their hands. So what are you going to do? It's important to think that our approach to technology or to security has had to change here. And so Justin Smith wrote this piece a few years back about the three R's of enterprise security: rotate, repave, repair. And his whole argument here is that you have to move fast to stay safe, which is a change from our traditional approach, which is, oh, let's move slowly, let's pour concrete over our infrastructure. And his whole argument is, no, you got to go fast to stay safe, because if you're constantly patching, you're starving your attackers of the resources they need to grow. You look at some of these large hacks that have happened, and your adversaries were sitting in your data center for months undisturbed. A friend of mine told me at their organization, they have sort of a standard policy that app instances are destroyed and recreated about every hour or so, with the argument being, how far can an attacker get in an hour? So we need to think about our patching strategy. We need to think about what version of a thing we're on, and more importantly, how we move to the next version. I've been at companies that have a policy of, hey, you got to be at N or N minus one. That's great. Do you measure it? And if you measure it, do you enforce it? Now, I remember several summers ago, I was doing an architecture review for an application, and I asked the lead architect, I said, "Hey, what version of that library are you using?" And he said, "Oh, 4.3." I said, "Well, congratulations, I have to mark you yellow." And he said, "Why?" I said, "Because you're now N minus two on that library." And he's like, "Well, when did it change?" I said, "It's been about 2 months now." And, I sent a half a dozen or so emails out to the distribution list about that. Was I supposed to come to your project room and tell you specifically? Now, even as the reviewing architect, I didn't have the ability to stop that app from going to production. All I could do is mark it yellow. I don't know if they ever actually fixed it. For all I know, it's running in production today. So that's ultimately a cultural issue, which is hard to change. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we could spend an hour and a half talking about culture and how much that impacts our company and our technology. But we have to ask ourselves, what would you rather try to figure out how to change our patching strategy, change the culture, or be the next largest hack ever? All right, so I'm just going to take a quick peek and see if there's anything on the questions here. Someone is listening to this on a bike ride. That is impressive. I appreciate that. Yes, hype-driven development gets in that same exact place. Is it true we cannot? It's true we can't read everything. How do we choose the best content? Some of that's very personal. What speaks to you, what approach works for you. I'm obviously very biased towards O'Reilly content. I've done a lot of work for them. I think it's important to focus on sources that you trust and that deliver good information. So I think about like my friends Neil Ford, Mark Richards, experts on architecture. they say something, I listen. If Sam Newman says something about microservices, my ears perk up. Simon Brown says something about documenting, my ears pick up. If Michael Nygaard's talking about pretty much anything, my ears perk up. So it's important, I think, to find those sources that you trust and go ahead and rely on that. And that might change throughout your career too, by the way. So don't be afraid to let that kind of move around as new things kind of come and go. Do you think it's ever possible or recommend a company to introduce absolutely new shiny technologies? Yeah, absolutely. There are times where that's the right choice. And a lot, the only true answer I can ever give you to any question, of course, is it depends. But, if we're a startup, it's the proverbial three of us in a garage, it might be in our best interest to, yeah, let's go on the shiniest new thing because we believe in it, that's where things are going. Some of this you can tell where the trend lines are, and that can be enough to tell you that yes, this is really what we want to do. Now if this is an older company, more conservative, that might not be the best approach. That might be a hard sell. There's some companies that are just afraid of change, they're slow to change, and so I have to be a little cautious in how I introduce those kinds of things. So yeah, there are times where being on the bleeding edge can be appropriate. We just have to understand those trade-offs, that it also means things aren't going to be as stable as we might like them to be. And in some instances that's perfectly reasonable, and others not so much. Some of that gets into sort of life criticality and sort of cost of failure. That's one of the things we always want to think about is what are the consequences of this going south. Do you recommend how come I can't make that show up on the screen? Sorry. Do you recommend minimum tests like POC, side, smaller projects? I think either's fine. And we can kind of get into a debate about terminology, if you will. Um, we do a lot of proof of concepts, especially as you become senior technologist, architect kind of person. I mean, I talk to a lot of people about going from developer to architect. And one of the things I always talk about is the fact that as an architect, most of the coding you do is going to be proof of concept coding. It's not going to be, that day in, day out, grab the next card kind of development, which for some people means they don't want to be an architect, and that's fine. So you're going to need to do some amount of that. Now, how big that gets, sort of where we draw the line on this is me spending a couple hours doing a to-do list versus I'm going to sit down and spend the next couple of months building out something bigger. It depends. Are we trying to make a decision for the company that this is going to be our new framework? This is how we're going to do things moving forward. Is this, I just need to get a sense of this for, this little kind of throwaway thing that's only going to be used by a few people? We have to kind of let, again, that sort of risk, cost, complexity kind of guide how much time we invest in that. In a perfect world, we could spend almost limitless time doing that, but we don't live in that world. We have to deliver value. We got to get code to production. Someone asked me a couple of years ago, should I use Angular or should I use React? And I said, well, the best way to make that decision is build the app using Angular, then build it again using React, and throw away the one you don't like. No one's ever going to give you the resources to do that. Sorry. So we always have to be very cautious and kind of where we draw that line, knowing that we're never going to get adequate time. So make sure you are doing the most significant things for you, that you're doing the use cases that matter most for you. My strategy is to get wide general knowledge about tools, deeper about architecture, principles, patterns. That's a great point. So we have this, and I think it's kind of a ridiculous notion of, the full stack developer, that you can somehow be an expert on everything. Not possible. Just think for a minute about all the things you would need to know to be a full stack developer. You need to know 2 or 3 or 4 front end languages, 2 or 3 or 4 back end languages, multiple databases, multiple cloud providers. And that's before we even get into things like testing, deployment, chaos engineering, SRE. The list just goes on and on. How could you possibly be an expert in all of that? Like heat death of the universe is going to happen first. I'm a much bigger fan of what they call T-shaped, which is you've got a breadth of knowledge. You are aware of all these different things, but you've gone deep in 1 or 2 or 3 areas. So for example, I am aware that there are NoSQL databases in the universe. I am not an expert on NoSQL databases. I am definitely not the person to talk to you about whether you should use Mongo or Cassandra or, insert whatever here. I know kind of the big picture, and that's about it. I've gone deep on UI technologies at one point in my career, although my knowledge isn't up to date. I spent a lot of time now in the cloud space, so I feel like I've got a pretty good depth of knowledge there. The challenge is knowing where you don't have that depth and knowing who to talk to help you round out that knowledge, that experience. Having smart friends is a huge win in this industry, and having people you can call and rely on and ping when, hey, I need to make a decision between A and B, and I know you know a lot about this. Can you help me, or at least point me in the right direction of how I would make that decision? So I would much rather be T-shaped. And I think to your point, it's also about going deeper on the things that don't change as often or as frequently, if at all. I mean, look at the Gang of Four patterns. That stuff is just bedrock as far as I'm concerned. And fascinatingly enough, an awful lot of those patterns have been subsumed by our languages and our tech stacks. So to me, I think that's a great point, is how do we focus our depth on the things that don't change as frequently and are more foundational in our industry? How do you convince people to switch to a new technology? I will talk about influence here in a minute, and worst case, I will jump ahead to those slides, because I being able to influence, being able to convince people is one of the most important tools you've got in the tool set. In a perfect world, you could just order people to do things, but people tend not to react well to that. You really ideally want to convince them that it's their idea to do this thing. So, all right, let's jump ahead here and let's talk about pros and cons. Now, this is obvious to any of us, I think, I hope, that every technology choice involves some trade offs. That's just the nature of the beast. And so when someone comes to you and says, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing ever, you should be like, well, hang on, what are the trade offs? This is design in a nutshell. This is architecture in a nutshell. And of course, the challenge is we always can say, well, on one hand, you could do this. On the other hand, you could do that. Sort of paraphrase Harry Truman. Please, someone give me a one-handed technologist. So should I use React or Angular? Should we refactor to microservices? Should we be on-prem? Should we be in public cloud? Well, you can probably guess what I'm going to say next. But there's three answers that work for every question you've ever gotten in computer science. There's 42. That's the geek check to see who's well read. As an architect, I'm a big fan of another layer of indirection. But the answer that I have to give a lot, and it's one I've already given here today, is it depends. Now, some people get mad when they hear it depends because they think this is a way of shutting down the conversation. It's not. It's meant as a way to begin the conversation. And so someone says it depends and then tries to stop. You say, well, what does it depend on? Let's have that discussion. And it's important to realize that in a lot of cases, these aren't or decisions, they're and decisions. You're going to use this and that. And the challenge for us is, how do I balance these opposing forces off one another? How do I get that tension right? Because there is no such thing as a perfect technology. I'm sorry. You should always be willing to acknowledge the negatives. And so if you bring a new technology to me, there's a couple of questions I'm going to ask you right off the bat. The first one is, well, what do you like about it? And I'll let you in a little secret. I don't really care what you say here. I mean, I do, because I'm a technologist and so I'm interested, but this isn't the important question. The important question is my follow-up, which is, what don't you like about it? You better have a good answer to this. If you haven't played with it very long, you'll struggle here. But take any tool, language, technology, framework, IDE, editor, whatever, that you can't imagine living without. If I tried to take it from you, we'd be having a rather heated discussion. As much as you love it, as much as you can't imagine your day without it, there's something about it you change. There's some rough edge that you're like, oh, how come they haven't buffed this down yet? I love Keynote. This is my preferred way of delivering presentations. I've tried everything else. Keynote is my trusted friend. And as much as I love Keynote, and as much as I've found some interesting edge cases with Keynote, what really annoys me is, at least so far, I've never figured out how to include slides in other decks. Now, granted, maybe my use case is not typical, but like any good engineer, I like to reuse. And so there's sections that I use across different decks. And I'd really like to just have one place where I can maintain those. And then when I make a change, it's reflected in all the decks that include that deck. That isn't a feature. It's not there. It's so annoying. So it doesn't matter what that technology is, what the language is, what the tool is. There's something about it you don't like. You don't see that right away. It takes time. You got to spend time with it to learn where the edge of the map is, where the dragons be. And so another way of kind of pulling this out of people is, and this, by the way, works as a great interview question with at least as long as they're not right out of university. If they're right out of university, it's not fair. But if you got somebody that's been in our line of work for a few years, you can, and they're an expert on, or they're at least, beyond sort of the intro stage of something. Oh, okay, cool. I'm going to put you in charge of it. You're in charge of Java or Angular or whatever it happens to be. You can add any feature you want. However, you've got to remove a feature first. What would you do? So if I put you in charge, what would you do? Again, the real interesting part there is what would you get rid of to add the feature that you want? I love this Kelsey tweet. I love a lot of Kelsey's tweets, but this is one of my all-time favorites. You haven't mastered a tool until you understand when it should not be used. We are experts at coming up with justifications where we should use something. Much more important for us to be thinking about where we should not use something. I can give you I guess an analogy here. So last year, my wife and I finished our basement, by which I mean we paid other people to do the work because I'm a software guy. I don't know anything about hardware. I have one hammer, and that's more than sufficient for me to screw up all sorts of projects around the house. But the people we paid to come do the work, they didn't have one hammer. They had a whole truck full of hammers, and they knew when to use which one. They knew when it was time to use the finishing hammer, when it was time to use the framing hammer. And if we were doing demolition, they would have grabbed a sledgehammer, and they know when to use which one. It's the same for us. We need to know, well, when should we use microservices? When should we use serverless? When is this language appropriate? When is that language appropriate? When is this pattern the right choice? And so to me, that's the real challenge here is when should you not use whatever your favorite thing happens to be? So we can use spreadsheets to help us here. How does it stack up the alternatives? I don't love spreadsheets, but sometimes that's your best bet. You put your options across the top, you put your criteria down the left. Now you can weight your criteria if you wish, but then you start getting into this whole debate about what's my scoring criteria? Do I use a 1 through 5 scale? Here's the challenge with a numeric scale. Somebody's going to invert your scale. Does not matter how many times you say 1 is good, 5 is bad, someone's going to interpret it the opposite way. I actually had one peer of mine who was clearly doing this review over the course of multiple weeks, and he changed his scale during his evaluation. So in like one part of his document, 1 was good, and then another part of his document, 5 was good. It was just maddening. I'm a fan of Harvey balls, and that's these guys, not filled in, all the way filled in, somewhere in between. And it's just a fancy way of saying, how does it map to the criteria? I have found that to be very, very effective. So, for example, I might have something that looks a little bit like this. If I were doing a comparison between Angular and React, these are some of the things that I look at, frankly, if I'm evaluating something, and it's obviously very close. Now, I would very strongly want to point out this is subjective. There's no formula I can apply that says, well, of course, this is obviously the right answer. You could take the exact same criteria I did, do the exact same evaluation, and come up with a different answer. It's fine. I could move any one of these a quarter point and lose no sleep. It's subjective. There is no clear cut, yes, this is the only possible answer you could get. Now, part of the challenge that we face as senior technologists is, well, what criteria should you use? How should you weight them? Guess what? That's up to you. I've never had anyone say this is how you should do it. They just say, go make the evaluation. You're the architect, figure it out. You can try to slant things one way or the other. You can put your thumb on the scale. Be very careful here. This almost always backfires. Let's take a moment to talk about quality attributes. Now, I grew up calling these non-functional requirements, and several years ago, one of my peers was using the term quality attributes, and I finally said, hang on, Mark, you've been doing this longer than me. Aren't those non-functional requirements? He says, yes, it's the same term. I said, well, why do you keep calling them quality attributes? And he said, well, think about it, Nate. You have a conversation with your customer and you start talking about non-functional things. Your customer's like, I don't want any of that non-functional stuff. I want functional stuff. But if you call them quality attributes, now you're like, oh, well, yeah, I want quality. Of course, it's a different conversation. Now, some people call them quality goals, constraints, quality of service goals, the cross-functional requirements, the architecturally significant requirements. otherwise known as the ilities, because so many of them have ility at the end of them. And of course, I love throwing ility on the end of something just to see what happens. Now, again, our customers focus on functionality, and they should. It's what they see. It is vital that we meet those needs. It's vital that the application do what they need it to do. But as architects, we have to think big picture. We've got to look at the whole forest here, and we have to focus on the quality attributes. Now, you might think of these even as service level objectives, if that's another way of sort of pondering this. Now, the list of quality attributes goes on and on and on. Maintainability tends to be at the top of many of our lists. We want our code to be more maintainable. I've yet to run into a developer who would say something along the lines of, I wish this code was harder to maintain. That would bring me much joy. We talk a lot about scalability, and for some applications, this is critical. This has got to work. If you are a retailer and you're selling things online, you better be able to handle these unexpected spikes, for sure. But there's a lot of apps that just don't have those demands. We have this tendency to always think about stuff in terms of Netflix and Twitter and Google scale. There's not a lot of companies that work at that scale. And so we might not have the same exact demands. I sure hope my software is reliable. I hope people are caring about security. We're thinking more and more about deployability today. I wish more people cared about simplicity. There's a great presentation by Rich Hickey a number of years ago now about basically easy versus simple, and how we have a tendency to fall into the easy trap instead of thinking about what's the simple way to do this. This industry fetishizes complexity. We love throwing up these diagrams that are impossible for people to read and just sort of threatening them like, haha, see how smart I am. I'm a big fan of usability. This has been one of my focus areas forever. I always look at doors thanks to reading Design of Everyday Things. It's ruined me in some ways, although I'm very much of the opinion anyone who designs anything that's used by humans should be required to read Design of Everyday Things. Compatibility, fault tolerance, modularity. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Now, of course, you take a step back and you ask yourself, well, what quality attributes do you focus on? And of course, the only answer I can give you here is it depends. It depends on the kind of software that you build day in, day out. I've spent most of my career doing enterprise web apps. And so for most of my career, I could say just throw more hardware at the problem. I've had a number of students. In fact, I think this year my grad students, it was almost half of my class were IoT type people. They were working on embedded systems. Very different set of constraints. You can't just throw more hardware at it. That might not work from a profitability standpoint. You might already have a limit on, hey, this is how much we can spend on the bill of materials. And so no, we can't just get a bigger processor or throw more memory at it or whatever. We just don't have that luxury. We don't get to turn all the knobs to 11. This is another part of the challenge here. It's so easy to say, well, let's just keep cranking that up. And then you realize pretty quickly that a lot of these actually have inverse relationships. That if I've maximized one, I've almost by definition minimized another. So security and usability are a perfect example of this. I can make a system that's secure. I just won't let you log on to it. And I'll lock it in a room and I won't connect it to the internet. Boom, secure. But that's not very useful. I think about this a lot from an air travel standpoint. I think back, I was going to say fondly, but maybe not. I didn't love getting on airplanes, but I spent a lot of time on airplanes. Every so often, you'd see an article about, the security at the airport missing, banned items or whatever, missing contraband. I never lost a lot of sleep over that because, let's be honest, most people don't actually have, ill intent. They just forgot something in their bag. Although some of the things people forget are in their bag is a little concerning to me, but we'll leave that for another day. And the thing is, you could make a security setup at an airport that is so secure nothing bad ever happens, but no one would ever fly. You'd have to arrive at the airport a couple days before your flight. You would be subjected to what would be politely called a medical procedure. You wouldn't enjoy it. You'd never put yourself through it unless that was literally the only way you could make this trip happen. And so that's the trade-off that we have to have. It's this balance that we're always striving for. And of course, part of the challenge that we face is that some of these things are obvious to our customers. And so they're an easy conversation to have. If the system won't support the user load, well, yeah, we better fix that. Our customers are more and more aware of these bugs like Heartbleed and the Equifax hack and all these sort of related things. Nobody wants to be the next largest hack ever, I hope. And so people are aware that this matters and that we have to put some effort and energy into it. So it's fairly easy to convince people that that's important, but there's a lot of stuff we deal with that is for all practical purposes invisible, or at least much harder to see. So maintainability and simplicity are a perfect example. Is how do I convince my customer that maintainability is in their best interest, or that simplicity is in their best interest? Like, I can't use technical terms here because they don't care. They don't have to maintain it. So I have to put this in terms they can understand. So how do I get that buy-in? How do I influence people? And this was actually getting back to one of the questions we had earlier. How do I influence people? Well, I start by outlining the benefits. Here's why this is in our best interest. I search for common ground. We can both agree release weekend has too much drama. I think if we have higher code quality, we'll see less drama. That works for both of us, right? Watch out for aggression. It's so easy to get aggressive in these situations and sort of rely on our brain pan and, I'm smart, so you should just listen to me because I'm smart. Why aren't you doing what I say we should do? You need to put on your listening hat. And this one's hard. I'm not great at it. My wife will attest to that. She's in the other room if you want me to ask her. But you got to listen, and you actually have to have a conversation. It's important to understand that it can be difficult to convince people of something. And there's two primary approaches to try to getting people to do something for you. And that's the hammer. I'm going to order you to do this. And there's the ninja. I'm going to make you think it's your idea. I'm going to tell you two stories to kind of bring this point home. They both involve my family. My son, who's a teenager now, I'm the proud owner of a teenager. It's fascinating. When he was much younger, the daycare center we took them to had a standing rule: thou shalt wash your hands before being released into general population. Any of you that have kids, have young kids, know that they're kind of walking petri dishes, and personal hygiene's not high on their list. Although there have been a couple times where we've had to use the smell test to decide that, my now teenager needs to go take a shower. Actually, we have a standing rule in my household: if you don't know the last time you showered, you have to go shower right now. So that's worked out fairly effectively. But going back in time, we'd get to the daycare center, be early in the morning. I would have had no espresso yet, and so I'd tell my then young son, "Hey, buddy, please go wash your hands." Now, if you've ever had a kid, you know what comes next. No. So I'm not the most. I don't have the biggest parenting toolkit. I don't have a lot of resources at my disposal, and so I repeat my request a little louder and remind him of our relationship status in case he forgot overnight. I'd say, "Everett, I'm your father. Go wash your hands." He would just cross his little arms and say, "No, never." Now at this point, I'm out of ideas. I don't know what to do. Do I put the foot down? What does that even mean? And so this is when my wife would step in, proving she's so much better at this whole parenting thing. And she'd say, "Hey, buddy, bet I can get my hands washed before you can." And she'd take one step towards the sink, and he'd run over and start washing his hands. "Ha ha, mommy, I beat you." And she would just say, "Yes, yes, you did." Now the other example I'll give you here also involves my wife. This was maybe 6 months ago or so. She had made vegetarian quesadillas for dinner, and they're quite delicious. I quite like them. But I made the comment, I'm like, "Didn't we just have vegetarian quesadillas like last week?" And my wife just kind of looked at me and said, "Well, you come up with a vegetarian meal then, smart guy." My son and I both kind of looked at each other, and I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Oh, yeah, at least once a week I make a meal that doesn't have any meat in it." My son and I kind of looked at her like, "Wait, what? How long has this been going on?" She said, "About a year." My son and I hadn't noticed because she found ways to sort of sneak it in. Actually, ironically enough, I'm making a vegetarian meal tonight, something that she's kind of mastered, this sort of buttered bean thing that, I mean, it's got enough butter to, drown a cow, but it's delicious. And my kid will eat it, which is really the important thing, because if left to his own devices, he wants all of the meats. We had to run some errands yesterday, and we happened to be near a butcher store. And my son said, "Dad, can we stop at Von Hanson's and get some meat?" And I'm like, "Dude, I just grilled like 2 days ago." So, "I know, let's get some meat." And so I stopped and picked up some chicken and some steak, and that's what we had for dinner last night. So definitely left to his own devices. He's a carnivore. So my wife, knowing that, snuck it in without being upfront about it. And had she tried the hammer approach, she would have gotten resistance. But she did the ninja, and we didn't even notice. We ate better. So, win-win. So the challenge for us is figuring out who these influential people are in your organization. By the way, the org chart might not help you in any way, shape, or form here, but our job is to influence the influencers. And that can be tough, by the way. But you want to approach as equals. You don't want to sort of go hat in hand, "Please, I have another." Rely on the strength of your ideas. Rely on your reputation. By the way, your reputation speaks for you when you're not in the room. If you're not sure what your rep is, don't be afraid to ask. Now, be prepared that you may not like the answer, but that's the only way you can work to change it. Some number of years ago, I had gotten this reputation as being the crazy open source guy, and I don't know why that was considered a bad thing, to be honest with you. But I had a couple directors that just didn't like that. They weren't big open source fans. And so I asked my manager one day, I said, "Do I still have that reputation?" And he said, "I don't know. Let me find out for you." And a couple days later, he came back and said, "No, no, you've shed that one." Now, in fairness, I'm not sure what I did to shed it, but I did, and that helped with my relationship with those directors. So good. The other thing to keep in mind is this is useful for your career as well. I had a friend of mine who felt like he'd gotten passed over for a job, and he asked our former manager, "Hey, Jeff, was I even in the conversation for that job?" And Jeff said, "Well, hate to say this, but you weren't. Your name really never came up." And that obviously hurt my friend. That stung a bit, but he's like, "Oh, okay. Well, what can I do to make sure my name does come up the next time one of these positions is available?" And that gave my friend an opportunity to say, "Well, is that something I'm actually interested in? Do I really want to do that or not?" And then he understood a little better about why he wasn't in the conversation this go around. Look for common ground. Reciprocity is your friend. I'll do this for you if you do that for me. Volunteer, be helpful. This goes a long way. Just by having that reputation of being helpful and respectful is usually a very good thing. I shouldn't even have to say this if you went to kindergarten, but please be respectful of other people. Research your ideas. Use trusted sources. You don't have to love the source, by the way, but if you know that the decision maker uses it, take advantage of that. Recruit credible allies. There is nothing wrong with bringing a drone to a gunfight. Don't be afraid to bring help. If you I've noticed this before that sometimes that influence is almost by like association. And so like if you sit next to the influential person, people are like, well, Nate's sitting next to the important person, so he must be important too. So don't be afraid to let that sort of kind of leak out on you a little bit as well. You do need to speak their language. As an industry, we love technobabble. We love the jargon. And in fairness, that's kind of how you know who's in the tribe and who's not. Your customers don't care. All right. Just because you understand all that doesn't matter. To the vast majority of the universe, spring is a season, not a Java framework. So, what resonates in your organization? How do you need to frame your arguments for it to have the most impact? Is it all about cost savings? Is it all about developer productivity? Is it all about speed to market? Don't be afraid to shape your message accordingly. All right, let me take a quick look and see if we have other questions. Answered that one. All right, I think I believe I hope that tells you how I try to convince people about how to do new things. Uh, you, I could say just do it. um, that does tend to backfire, and that is one of those things we need to be at least a little bit aware of. That I have this sort of pocket theory that developers are like cats in the sense that if you ask a cat to come here, the cat goes in the opposite direction just on principle, just to remind you that no, I'm a cat, not a dog. Developers are kind of the same way. If I order a developer to do something, almost by definition, they're like, "Well, I'm not going to do that then. I mean, not if you tell me that's what I have to do, then I'm definitely not going to do. I'm going to do something totally different." So I'm not a huge fan of ordering people to do things. I have found that just tends to backfire and just not be very productive. So I try to avoid that wherever humanly possible. Well, let's see. We're just about out of time. Let me see if there's something I can kind of wrap up with here. Gotta be. Yeah, let me talk briefly about architectural decisions just because it's kind of all part of this whole conversation about making change happen and whatnot. At some point on your project, you're going to make a choice. You're going to say, we're going to go on left instead of right. You hit that fork in the road. Decisions happen. That's totally natural. The challenge for us is how would you say you document that? And I'm a huge believer in these lightweight architectural decision records. This is actually something that came out from, I think Michael Nygaard wrote about it a decade ago, maybe. Real straightforward. You have a title, maybe you have an auto incrementing ID. What would you say the problem is? Don't skimp here. Just because you're knee deep in the problem and you know it intimately, and you can just say, the problem we had on the project. Well, no, we got to have more because you're going to look at this in 2 months or 2 years and not remember all that context. Don't be afraid to be verbose here. A couple paragraphs, couple pages, pictures. What are the assumptions? What are the constraints? There's always assumptions and constraints. Do not think you're going to remember that in 10 years. What are your options? Some of those options, maybe you've already decided we're not even going to bother with this because of XYZ. Great, write that out. What are the pros and cons of each of those alternatives? Again, don't be afraid to be a little verbose here. Which ones did you choose? Most importantly, why did you choose that one? You might want to put a status on here. Is this just a proposal? Has this been accepted? Is this deprecated? What are the consequences of this decision? Because we chose to do this, this is what happened. I'm a huge believer in creating a little time capsule for these, which is basically just a little screencast, a little podcast. It doesn't have to be super high fidelity. Just use whatever headphones you've got. Most of our laptops have got great cameras, great mics on them, and just record a little. This is what I did. This is why I did it. 3, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, whatever, just so that in a couple months, a couple years, you've got something else you can kind of go back. Oh yeah, that's right. That's why we did this thing. So don't be afraid to build this little thing to help you. So in the future, you're not kind of scratching your head going, why did we do that? I know we had a good reason. I just don't remember what it was. Don't be afraid to put these in version control. Don't be afraid to keep the old ones around. Just make sure that they're marked appropriately if they're no longer valid. And of course, don't ship those to production. Oops. Wrong slide. All right, here we go. As senior technologists, architects, we got a lot of things to juggle. And I think it's vital that we think strategically. We do everything in our power to avoid resume-driven design. I wish you luck. Are there any additional questions, comments, queries, anything else I can do to help you here this evening?
If there are any other questions, please write them down now. From my side, I'll take a minute to ask you guys to fill out the survey we usually do after our meetups. There are a feedback for Nate and for us to just make a better presentation, better meetups, and just better organizing our WJUG meetings and meetups. So if you be so kind and fill in this survey under the link I've just shown here. I don't see any other question coming in, but David will post a link to Meetup, Google Meet conversation we have set up for you guys. So if anyone wants to join us there, feel free, and you'll have the opportunity to ask some more questions on this short integration after the talk. I think that's everything. Nothing's coming up here. So I think that's everything for now. Thank you very much, Nate. Thank you for being here with us tonight and for sharing the knowledge. I hope that everyone else of our viewers enjoyed that as much as I did. And hopefully we'll meet in person next time in Warsaw.
I hope so.
Yep. So hopefully it will happen soon enough. Okay. So as I mentioned, feel free to join us on our Google Meet. The link will be on the YouTube chat. And thank you very much, all viewers, for watching us tonight. And see you on sometimes on September when we will be back with new season of Warsaw Java User Group. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nate. Good night.
Good night, everybody. Cheers.